remove its nuclear weapons from Europe, the nightmare situation is haunting Europeans, with the Trump administration repeatedly pressing Europe that it should carry the burden of its own security. European leaders are openly looking for alternative protection that is within the continent. Is this the moment when Europe finally takes its defense into its own hands?
Missile strikes have been a key feature of Russia's offensive in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Many of the systems it fires at the country are capable of also delivering nuclear warheads. From Kinzhal to Oreshnik, Russia has repeatedly used nuclear-capable missiles with conventional payloads. The West too kept raising the nuclear rhetoric, with the US announcing the deployment of long-range missiles in Germany by 2026 to bolster NATO's deterrence against Russia. Ever since the advent of nuclear arms, Europe has been protected by an American nuclear umbrella. It was the United States that promised NATO allies that any nuclear aggression by the Soviet Union and later by Russia would be answered with a barrage of US missiles, which are stored in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy and Turkey. For 7 decades, this arrangement allowed Western Europe to focus on recovering from the devastation of the 20th century's 2 world wars instead of developing costly nuclear capabilities. Only France and the UK developed small national arsenals, and they were just a fraction of the size of those controlled by the Cold War superpowers. Russia possesses a total of 5,889 nuclear warheads, the largest confirmed stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world, while the Americans have 5,224 nukes in their arsenal. Now, as Trump shifts US foreign policy, the American nuclear umbrella could slowly diminish, leaving Europe vulnerable. Germany sees the writing on the wall. Friedrich Merz, likely to become Germany's next chancellor, calls for a new nuclear security structure led by the UK and France. According to reports, France says it is ready to use its nuclear deterrent to help protect Europe. Fighter jets carrying nuclear weapons could be deployed to Germany. The big question, will the US really move its troops and nukes from Europe as it increasingly keeps going closer into Russia's embrace? The entire European security matrix would go haywire, and the scramble is on to prepare for the future. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Joining us live on the broadcast from Washington, D.C. is Peter Kuznick, who is a professor of history at American University. Peter, welcome back to WION, and great to see you. The Trump administration has said that U.S. troops can't remain in Europe forever. So the question many are asking, including the Europeans themselves, is how does this alter Europe's security metrics at this point?
Well, the Europeans are concerned. They're discussing ways to take control of their own defense to a much greater extent than has been the case throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War. So Trump is clearly a disruptor. He clearly has less of a commitment to European security than do any of his predecessors, really. And we're going to see what happens. With Merz's victory in Germany, now we've got Merz calling for French and British nuclear deterrent inside of Germany. So the United States has had a small number of nuclear weapons inside Germany for quite a while. And now they're looking to the French especially, but also the British to replace the U.S. weapons. Merz has said that Europe can no longer count on the United States for its security. So we're approaching a new period now, which in many ways could be quite dangerous and quite alarming. Right now, of the 32 NATO countries, 23 spend 2% of their GDP on their militaries. But Trump is calling for the European nations to spend 5% of their GDP. So I think the world is going the wrong direction. On the other hand, Trump called for U.S. and Russia and China cutting their military spending by 50%. And Putin responded affirmatively to that. We haven't heard from China yet, but clearly the U.S. and Russia are looking for ending the fighting in Ukraine and at least talking about cutting their nuclear arsenals. And I see that as a direction that's much more positive and promising than this military buildup that we see looming in Europe right now.
And there is this concern by the Europeans that the United States, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, will move closer to Moscow. What are your thoughts on that?
The United States is clearly moving closer to Moscow. The Europeans have good reason to be concerned about that because it's a complete reversal of the Biden policy, and in many ways a reversal of longstanding U.S. policy. So the Europeans who bought into the strong defense of Ukraine after the Russian invasion 3 years ago yesterday, now are having the rug pulled out from under them by the United States. And their whole appeal to their countries has been that they've got to arm and defend Ukraine, because if Putin is successful in Ukraine, then he's going to gobble up one piece of Europe after another. There's no evidence to support that view. I think it's wrong-headed. If Russia has had such a hard time winning in Ukraine, do they really want to take on NATO? I don't think so. That would be totally irrational. Now, is Russia capable of irrational actions? I suppose so. But I think we should be planning for a peaceful world rather than a more militarized world. And we see this going on everywhere. Zelensky is calling on the Europeans to rearm, to create new armies, to spend more on their militaries, to create a European-wide military defense. Macron has been calling for this for a while, Starmer also. And so we see a lot of pressure inside Europe to increase their military spending, increase their deterrence against a supposed Russian attack. But I don't see that as in any way likely, but I see it as a kind of fear-mongering that is convincing many of the Europeans to spend on their militaries money that should be spent on their schools, on their housing, on their health care, on their education more broadly. But they're going the opposite direction now. And I see the world overall going in the opposite direction. And that's unfortunate right now, as we're seeing the services that people need being cut and the military's expanded.
And Peter, my final question is regarding how Europe can ultimately keep up with these demands coming from Ukraine. Do you see in the foreseeable future that President Trump, and we're also talking about that rare minerals deal with Ukraine, can ultimately bring Ukraine and Russia to the Ukrainian table, to the negotiating table, and then Europe would also join as well? Or is this just going to be Europe on one side, as we saw at the General Assembly and the UN yesterday, and the United States on the other, and Ukraine sort of in the middle here?
Well, right now it looks more like the latter scenario. But as you heard Macron's comments yesterday, he said he welcomed Trump's outreach to Russia, even though he corrected Trump on a number of points and talked about the need for Europeans to stand on their own. But Trump and Putin seem to be sincere about wanting to move toward a resolution of the fighting in Ukraine. It's clearly in everybody's interest to do so. Does Trump have the diplomatic skill to pull that off? That's another question, because that would need to include the Europeans. It would need to include the Ukrainians, as well as the Americans and the Russians and others. So can Trump do that? Right now, he's giving very mixed messages. And unless he can find a way to include other countries in these deliberations, his efforts are likely to fail. However, the world is very ready after 3 years for this fighting to end. And we know the basic outlines of what that agreement would look like. And the Americans laid it out 2 weeks ago in a series of talks. It's going to mean Russia taking perhaps 20% of Ukraine. It's going to mean Ukraine agreeing to not enter NATO, and probably NATO rescinding its 2007-2008 offer to include Ukraine. And it's going to be various other measures. Right now, the Europeans hold $300 billion of Russian assets. Well, it sounds like the Russians say they are willing to let that be used for Ukrainian reconstruction, as long as a good portion of that goes to the regions in Russia, regions in Ukraine that have now become part of Russia. At least Russia has claimed them. So there's a lot of other issues that we can deal with, but at least there is a basis for ending this fighting, which has been brutal, horrific, costly, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. All right. We'll be watching very closely. Professor, thank you so much for joining us on WION. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Me too.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.